So... Mia, get down!
Hello everybody, my name's Jack from 𝗀𝗚 and welcome to my Resident Evil Village optimization guide. So Resident Evil 8, or Village as I'll refer to it from now on, is a truly beautiful game with some of the best graphics I've seen from a video game in a long time. But with that being said, with great graphics comes great GPU load, and today we're going to take a look at how we can reduce that load as much as possible while maintaining the best visual fidelity we can. Now I know this game is very new, so I'm only going to be using footage from the early game, so there'll be no spoilers in this video. You are absolutely free to watch without ruining the story. Village has many settings that affect its visual fidelity, but also has many settings that do not or are down to personal preference. We're first going to look at the settings that do make a huge difference, and then we'll get the preferences out of the way towards the end of the video. I'll structure it in a way where the settings go in chronological order, so you can just follow along as the video progresses. Now you might have noticed that within settings, Village does have an image in the bottom right that shows you the effect visually changing the settings is going to have, and it does have a little bar chart at the bottom that does display the load it's going to have on your system. Now I'm going to attempt to go more in depth on this and build on this feature that they've included. It's just a massive plus to see a game have this feature. Many more need it. So first up then is rendering mode. With rendering mode, you get two options, normal and interlaced. Well, what's the difference? Well, normal is a progressive scan of the image that renders the image from left to right, whereas interlaced renders in kind of a checkerboard pattern at a lower resolution than your native resolution. So for example, 1920 might be 720. It is then upscaled with 2 times MSAA to meet your native resolution, resulting in faster rendering. This is also sometimes referred to as temporal filtering. Many argue that interlaced rendering doesn't decrease the image quality at all, and I guess it's open to interpretation because sometimes it can make literally no difference to the image. It may look a bit muddier or a little bit more aliased, but sometimes you get a decent performance increase for using interlaced over normal. So let's take a look at our results. As you can see, there is a definite performance increase to be had when opting for interlaced over normal, with a nice 171 FPS average over normal's 146 FPS average. Now that's not going to mean a whole lot if interlaced makes the image look terrible, so let's take a look at both images side by side and see if there is a discernible difference. Now we have normal render mode here, and soon interlaced is going to slide through the screen, and as you can see, following the slider, you can see that the image gets a little bit more cloudy, tree detail disappears slightly, and the whole screen space gets a little more aliased. Now, to be honest, for the performance gains that this offers, and the potential to be used at higher resolutions to squeeze out some more valuable FPS, I'm not too mad at the quality difference here. I mean, I'm not going to recommend you put it on interlaced, but it definitely is an option if your GPU isn't up to scratch. So for now, I'm going to say leave it on normal. Next up on our list is image quality. Image quality, or resolution scaling as it's more commonly referred to, all this setting does is take your resolution in game and multiplies it by whatever number is set in the settings. So half resolution would be native with an image quality of 0.5, 1 would be native, and times 2 would be times 2 native, obviously. So instead of going through all of the different divisions, I just opted to a 0.5 jump each time to give me 4 settings to look at. So let's take a look at them right now. Under normal circumstances, I'd tell you to just play at your monitor's native resolution, but I just want to give you the opportunity to show you what resolution scaling does and how it affects performance. So you can see at 0.5, which is half resolution, we've got 183 average FPS, 1 times which is 171 FPS, 1.5 times which is 100 FPS, and 2 times which is 56 FPS. Now you'd think that double would be half the FPS, but for some reason it's more than half, not quite sure why it does that, but I'm going to say keep it on your normal native resolution because there is really no real need to go above your native resolution. You're not really going to see a benefit if you're trying to display 4K on a 1080p monitor, so definitely leave it on native. Next up we have FidelityFX CAS 𝗀𝗍. This is an AMD technology, CAS standing for Contrast Adaptive Sharpening. This helps sharpen an image after anti-aliasing effects such as 𝗙𝗃 is applied to the image. Now, I would definitely say leave this on because you can see off has a slightly blurrier image where on is a little bit sharper. And with it coming in at less than 1 FPS performance hit, it's a no-brainer to leave it on really. So next up then is anti-aliasing. You get two options again with anti-aliasing. You get fast approximate anti-aliasing, which is FXAA, plus 𝗙𝗃, which is temporal anti-aliasing as we mentioned before, or just 𝗙𝗃 on its own. So let's give a breakdown about what these two things do so you can more properly understand what's going on. 𝗙𝗃 reduces temporal aliasing caused by the sampling rate or the number of frames per second of a scene being too low compared to the transformation speed of objects inside the scene. So in English, it tries to do a better job at preventing aliasing on objects moving fast within a scene. FXAA is kind of the performance answer to spatial anti-aliasing. The way FXAA uses lower amounts of processing power is the fact that it smooths pixels as they appear on screen as opposed to analysing the 3D models within the screen. It's often desirable for performance purposes but can leave the image looking slightly muddy or undesirably blurry. Which leads me right into my next point. Using FXAA plus 𝗙𝗃 only equates to about a 1 FPS loss over just using 𝗙𝗃. And to have that extra anti-aliasing can really help, especially if you're playing at lower frame rates. So here we go, as 𝗙𝗃 slides over the screen, you can definitely see that the screen space becomes a little less blurry once FXAA is removed. But overall I'd say it's not too noticeable, but it definitely can result in some aliasing under normal circumstances without FXAA enabled. So I would definitely say for the sake of screen quality and FPS, it's better to leave it on FXAA plus 𝗙𝗃. And next up on the list is variable rate shading. Variable rate shading, or VRS, is a touring feature that increases rendering performance and quality by varying the shading rate for different regions on the frame. So after taking a look at my results, you can see that prioritised performance has the best FPS with 168 average, balanced coming in at second with 167 average, and off coming in last with 164 average. I know it's hard to tell when they're laid out like this, so let's jump into a direct comparison and see how these compare visually. Now, it's going to be hard for you guys to tell on YouTube because of the quality of YouTube, and to be honest, it's pretty hard for me to tell too. Between the images, there's not that much that changes other than the background becomes a little bit clearer when we get down to the off setting. Overall, off seems to be the best quality image, and for only a 4 or 5 FPS sacrifice, I'd definitely say that it's worth it. Balanced is acceptable, I'm okay with balanced, that seems to be a nice middle ground as balanced should be. But if you're struggling and you need an extra couple FPS, put it on balanced, but if not, I'd definitely say leave it at off. Now, on to texture quality. Texture quality in 𝗙𝗪𝗔's case is an easy one to demonstrate, but not so easy to explain. Now, you have settings like any other, low, medium and high, and each setting is accompanied by a number of gigabytes. Now, I'm assuming that number of gigabytes is the amount of VRAM the game is allocating to just textures, with most games having a bank of textures which are different resolutions depending on what setting you set in game. Now, I say it's easy to demonstrate because right here next to me I've got the lowest texture settings and the highest texture settings, and they're both at the exact same FPS. Is it broken? No, it's not. It's because it's dependent on your resolution, and I'm assuming that you're only going to run into issues if you run out of VRAM. Now with a 2080 Super, VRAM wasn't too much of an issue. And at home with my 2080, I always set the texture quality to high 2GB and I've never seen an issue. It looks great, it runs great. So I'm going to say you're going to have to play around with this one a little bit, depending on how much VRAM you have and how powerful of a GPU you have, you're just going to have to play around. But my recommendation is definitely either high 2 or high 4. But obviously knock it down a couple of settings if you have a GPU with a lower amount of VRAM. Next up is texture filter quality, or anisotropic filtering as it's more commonly known. You got a few settings here, but we're mainly going to be focusing on lowest, which is trilinear, and highest, which is 16x anisotropic filtering. Anisotropic filtering is a method of enhancing image quality of textures on the surface of computer graphics that are at oblique viewing angles with respect to the camera. Basically, it helps textures to pop when you're looking at them from different angles. And as you can see with respect to performance, 16x anisotropic filtering gets us a 188 FPS average, with trilinear looking a bit more promising at 192 FPS. Now this is definitely a setting you're going to want to keep on, due to the fact you do a lot of crawling and crouching in the game, so you're definitely taking advantage of those oblique angles that I was talking about earlier, so you're definitely going to want that setting enabled. Anisotropic filtering 16x for a slight performance decrease, but it's really going to make your viewing experience a lot better. So next up on the settings list is mesh quality. All objects in games are made up of meshes of thousands of polygons linked together to form the shape of an object. The higher the mesh quality, the higher the polygon count, and the more detailed the object can be made to appear. In essence, this is what mesh quality is. It's increasing or decreasing the amount of polygons in a mesh. With that being said, in Village, this setting appears to be broken, or at least not functioning as intended. 156 basically average across the board no matter what texture setting I had enabled. Despite that, I couldn't even see a difference in game of models of people, furniture, ground quality, nothing. I could not find a difference. Maybe the setting's broken and it's stuck on 1 no matter what you set, or maybe the game's just that well optimized that textures look the exact same no matter what setting you've got them on. So for this, whack it on max now that there's no penalty. This may change in the future. If you notice after an update performance becomes sluggish, knock down the texture quality preset. Ray tracing is a setting within itself, so we're going to skip that for now and come back to it later. So next up we've got Ambient Occlusion. So what is Ambient Occlusion? Ambient Occlusion is a shading and rendering method used for global backgrounds or indirect shading of objects. This method is used to add more realism to the render because it creates soft global shadows that contribute to the visual separation of objects. So on the left here we've got 𝗀𝗫𝗁. Now this is a new kind of ambient occlusion which stands for Combined Adaptive Compute Ambient Occlusion. It's a FidelityFX effect much like CAS, and it's RDNA's optimized implementation of ambient occlusion that supports DirectX 12 and Vulkan. In the middle we've just got our standard SSAO, which is screen space ambient occlusion, and on the right we have off, which is no ambient occlusion at all. So on the performance side of things, you can see that 𝗀𝗫𝗁 offers an average of 159 FPS, SSAO an average of 161 FPS, and off averaging 164 FPS. So visually then, as we move from 𝗀𝗫𝗁 to SSAO, you can see that the beams on the right hand side become a lot less defined. And as you move from SSAO to off, you can see that all of the depth disappears from the image pretty much, and you're just left with general global shadows. This is a pretty significant visual decrease and one I suggest avoiding, so I'd say leave it on SSAO at a minimum. If you want to go 𝗀𝗫𝗁 then do it, it's only a couple of FPS decrease, but for a good middle ground I'd suggest leaving it on SSAO. Screen space reflections then, we just get a pretty simple on-off toggle for this one. Screen space reflection is a technique for reusing screen space data to calculate reflections. It's commonly used to create more subtle reflections such as on wet floor surfaces or in puddles. Screen space reflection is an expensive technique, but when used properly it can give great results. So I'm sure you've already gathered that the screen on the left is showing screen space reflections on, and you can see the reflection of the yellow crate in the water. But on the right you can see that screen space reflections are off and the crate is no longer visible. Now these calculated reflections are definitely going to come at a cost, but it's an extremely necessary cost. Now screen space reflections do later on get replaced by ray tracing if you opt to have that enabled, but that is again a much more tasking option. But screen space reflections are necessary for a good visual experience and you need to have them enabled. Next up is volumetric lighting quality. Volumetric lighting quality is just basically governing God rays and soft light, and as you can see it's a very taxing setting. Now we'll take a look at these settings side by side in a second to compare visuals, but first let's talk performance. High gives us a 77 FPS average, medium 111, low 121, and off 135. Now you wouldn't think that this setting would be such a hit on performance, but once you see what it actually does in areas where God rays are present, you'll see why. Personally, as we move from high to medium, I don't see that much of a difference, but once we get down from areas in medium to low, low to off, you will definitely see a difference. The light becomes less fluffy and less soft, it becomes more rigid, becomes sharper, which is not what you want for volumetric lights, and the overall image just looks a bit more dimly lit. Now you'll see if we move from low to off, you can really see the God rays disappear and basically a whole new image is painted. So for my recommendation and for the performance gains it offers, I'm going to say put the volumetric lighting quality onto medium. Now onto subsurface scattering. Again, a pretty simple option, we only get two settings to choose from, on or off. So what's subsurface scattering? Well, really quickly, it's also known as subsurface light transport. It's a mechanism of light transport in which light that penetrates the surface of a translucent object is scattered by interacting with the material and exits the surface at a different point. Basically, you can get the same effects by holding a torch up to your fingers. The light that shines through, that's subsurface scattering, and emulating this within games adds a great deal of realism when you're up close and personal, specifically to characters. Well, that's all well and good, but what's the performance like? Subsurface scattering enabled gives us an average FPS of 202, while subsurface scattering disabled gives us a 210 FPS average. So with subsurface scattering enabled, you can see the face looks nicely illuminated and the features are quite defined, whereas when we turn off subsurface scattering, you can see the face is a lot dimmer, a lot less defined, and a little more crispy, so to speak. I really like what subsurface scattering does for an image, but I don't think it's incredibly necessary, so if you need the few extra FPS, I'd definitely say turn it off. It's not going to be detrimental to your experience. Now next up is shadow quality. Shadow quality is pretty self-explanatory, it's the quality of shadows cast in-game. Resident Evil Village gives us 4 options to play with here, from max to low, and to be honest, I never really saw that much of a difference even when going from low to maximum. Shadows seem to be pretty well optimized, even in the sense that from low to max, it's only about a 21 FPS difference. But to be honest, for me, I'd say put them on high for that nice 13 FPS increase, and you're still getting the higher end of shadows to stop them looking muddy or look like they're a lower resolution. Next up is contact shadows. Now contact shadows are shadows obviously cast by objects in the room that aren't part of the global shadow map. Things like vases, tables, chairs, anything that isn't part of the environment per se. And performance wise, you can see that contact shadows being enabled only drops us off about 1 FPS. So I'd say definitely for visual quality purposes, you're best off leaving this option on, as it only costs 1 FPS in this particular scene, so again, it's a no-brainer. Second to last is shadowcash. Now shadowcash has a huge impact on FPS. As you can see, we're getting 216 with shadowcash enabled and about 153 with shadowcash disabled. Now how it works is, it takes the shadows in-game and caches them in your GPU's memory to decrease the load on your GPU while playing the game. Now this only works if you have a lot of video memory available. If you have a low amount of VRAM, it's not going to be able to cache properly, it's going to be dumping, and then you're going to get stuttering in-game. But as you can see, with it enabled and with a sufficient amount of VRAM, it makes a huge difference, over 60 FPS with a 2080 Super. Now it does say within the settings that enabling shadow cache uses about half a gig of VRAM, but I'm going to say play it safe and have at least a gigabyte available for the shadow caching to work properly. Definitely enable this setting. So last but not least, we have ray tracing. So what exactly is ray tracing? Ray tracing, in really simple terms, provides realistic lighting by simulating the physical behaviour of light. Ray tracing calculates the colour of pixels by tracing the path that light would take if it were to travel from the eye of the viewer through the virtual 3D scene. So with that very simple explanation of ray tracing out the way, let's see how we look performance wise. Ray tracing, divided up into the two settings it offers, both set to high gave us 94 FPS average, medium gave us 103 FPS average, and low gave us 119 FPS average. The main differences between these presets is the amount of light reflected and the amount of rays cast. You can see that the image on the left is purely a reflection of the wall behind it, and the image on the right on low is more just like lights being reflected off the floor. Medium is a nice middle ground between the two, offering an 8 FPS increase over high, and doesn't look all that bad compared to high either. So I'm going to say if you're going to use ray tracing, I'd definitely put it on the medium setting. To give you a better visual representation of what ray tracing does for a scene, here I'm pitting the high preset against screen space reflections, and you can see it is a huge difference night and day. Most of the screen space is being reflected back in the water. I absolutely love ray tracing, I just don't think it's worth the performance penalties it brings to the table these days. Maybe when we've perfected the art and it's a bit less intensive on GPU, then I'll learn to love it, but not for me. Because this video is getting a little long, I'm just going to list these settings off. These settings, bloom, lens flare, film noise, depth of field, lens distortion, are all those preference settings I talked about at the start of the video. You can enable these and disable these to taste, and as far as I tested, they do not affect FPS. If so, only marginally. I'm talking like 1 or 2 FPS. Right, well, I guess that's it. This has been my Resident Evil 8 optimization guide. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope it helped you out. Like I said, Resident Evil is an extremely well optimized game, but if you've got a GPU that's lacking a little bit, you can't get hold of one because there's a massive shortage, then hopefully this video helps you out and allows you to squeeze those precious few extra frames out of it you need to enjoy the game. So yeah, look out for more videos on the Benchmark channel. We've got a Resident Evil benchmark up now, I believe, so if you want to go check that out, that'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Give us a like, comment and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. This has been Jack from 𝗀𝗄𝗃, and I'll see you in the next one.